Hello, and welcome to my in-depth guide to the Super Idol Center of Attention boss encounter in Honkai Star Rail that debuted in version 4.2 as the Apocalyptic Shadow version of the @Sparksicon official boss. I'll be going over attacks, mechanics, some general tips, and characters that may be noteworthy for the fight. I will also attempt to explain its general attack patterns and behaviors based on my observations, but these can be much more tedious and difficult to determine, and, in a lot of cases, may not even be useful information. Summaries are included, and I'll leave timestamps in the description. As of the time of uploading, this boss is in the Apocalyptic Shadow 4.2 rotation, and while ideally a guide would be applicable across all iterations, when it comes to character selection, it's very difficult to decouple that from the changing Universal Ruinous Embers effect and selectable finalities axiom buffs. Future iterations of the boss encounter may also have different numbers, but are unlikely to change mechanically. If you're watching this for a rotation after 4.2, check the comments to see if I've made any additional comments or clarifications. To start with an overview of the boss's attributes, the boss as a whole involves 3 enemies that share HP, and the encounter has 2 phases. The main body, which bears its namesake Super Idol Center of Attention, is weak to physical, fire, quantum, and imaginary damage, and has a greater than standard 40% resistance to ice, lightning, and wind damage. It has 1 toughness bar of 440 toughness. The other 2 enemies that are part of the boss are Output Port 1 and Output Port 2. They have identical attributes, having a weakness to wind, quantum, and imaginary damage, a standard 20% resistance to physical, fire, ice, and lightning damage, and 1 toughness bar of 100 each. As part of the main gimmick of the fight, the boss will summon aggressive reading materials, rocking rebels, and livestream assistants, and some of their attributes are different in the context of this fight compared to their Memory of Chaos implementations. Aggressive reading materials have a weakness to physical, fire, and lightning damage, a standard 20% resistance to ice, wind, quantum, and imaginary damage, and 60 toughness each. Rocking Rebels have a weakness to physical, fire, wind, and imaginary damage, a standard 20% resistance to ice, lightning, and quantum damage, and 120 toughness each. Livestream Assistants have a weakness to fire, quantum, and imaginary damage, a standard 20% resistance to physical, ice, lightning, and wind damage, and 150 toughness. With the general enemy attributes out of the way, let's move on to the attacks, mechanics, and patterns, starting with the main gimmick of the fight. Super Idol can initiate something called Live Showdown, where it places a target character of your choosing into a so-called subfield, while the rest of your characters remain in the prime field. The subfield character is immediately advanced. While Live Showdown is active, Elation skills target subfield enemies, and a countdown for Live Showdown's automatic end appears in the action order. Aside from Elation skills, targets from any given field cannot target opposing units on the other field, though buffs may still be applied normally. Follow-up attacks target randomly if the intended target is on the other field. During Phase 1, 3 aggressive reading materials are summoned into the subfield, while in Phase 2, it is 2 Rocking Rebels and 1 Livestream Assistant. These enemies make up a durability gauge shown on the bottom right of the boss's HP bar, which I'll explain later. In Phase 1, each of the 3 aggressive reading materials make up a third of the gauge, while in Phase 2, the Livestream Assistant accounts for about 45% of the gauge, and the 2 Rocking Rebels for the remaining 55%. Subfield enemies start with 4 stacks of a damage dealt increase buff in Phase 1, and 5 stacks in Phase 2, but both result in a 60% total damage increase at the stack limit. Super Idol and the 2 output ports gain a 60% damage reduction buff and crowd control immunity instead. Subfield allies can gain multiple stacks of a res pen buff, with the same stack limits as the subfield enemy damage buff, totaling up to 30% res pen. Live Showdown is dispelled when its end is reached in the action order, if the designated subfield ally is defeated, or all subfield enemies are defeated. In the first 2 scenarios, Super Idol's behavior depends on the phase, and it and the output ports will retain a portion of the damage reduction effect equal to the percentage of the remaining durability gauge multiplied by the original damage reduction amount. In the latter scenario, enemies are inflicted with a 100% increased damage taken debuff for 2 turns and have their actions delayed, while allies gain 6 SP and immediately trigger an AHA instant with a fixed 20 punchline. Super Idol also takes 200 toughness damage and 10% max HP damage. This toughness damage can break the boss, which will be considered quantum break and can cause entanglement. If there are no Elation characters on the team, any AHA instance will instead use AHA skill Let There Be Laughter, which randomly targets 10 hits between all allies but only subfield enemies. It only deals 1 damage to allies per hit, but this is capable of defeating them. Unlike the Memory of Chaos version of this boss, at Sparksicon Official, Super Idol Center of Attention gains Toughness Lock at the start of combat, when Live Showdown is initiated, and during phase transitions, which prevents its toughness from being reduced below 1. It only loses Toughness Lock when Live Showdown is dispelled, which means Super Idol can only be weakness broken between instances of Live Showdown after the first one of the current phase. With the main fight mechanic out of the way, let's get into the actual enemies, starting with the output ports. The two behave largely the same. During Live Showdown, output port 1 starts at 0 stacks, and output port 2 at the aforementioned stack limit corresponding to the subfield enemy's damage buff. When attacked, they fully advance in the action order, whereupon they will either buff the subfield ally character's res pen in the case of output port 1, or, in the case of output port 2, remove stacks of the damage dealt increase buff from the subfield enemies. 1 stack is gained or removed per attack received, with the res pen buff stacking up to the same limit that output port 2 starts at, but changes are only applied once the output port actually takes its turn. Once output port 1 stacks are maxed out, attacking it will no longer cause it to advance, and the same applies to output port 2 when it is already at 0 stacks. Output ports will reset their stacks to the initial amounts at the start of Super Idol's turns. Additionally, causing any output port to reach its stack limit will deal 15% max HP damage to all subfield enemies and grant the team 5 punchline. Due to the stage 4 boss trait, which is not listed in any of the enemy skills lists, all enemies take 10% less damage for each output port that hasn't reached the stack limit. Upon exiting Live Showdown, output ports will sync back together in the action order if they were desynced during Live Showdown, though they can still be desynced again via action delays or slows. Their next turn will announce that they are preparing to go live, and if either of them gets the chance to do so, Super Idol will initiate Live Showdown on the extra action of its next turn. On to the enemies summoned during Live Showdown. Aggressive reading materials have 1 standard single target attack. They also enter combat with a buff that increases damage dealt by 50% and reduces damage received by 50%. This buff cannot be dispelled through normal means, but is removed upon receiving elation damage or when the team reaches 20 points of punchline. 2 Rocking Rebels are summoned for Phase 2 Live Showdown. Unfortunately, I was not able to confidently determine the entirety of their battle logic, at the very least not in the context of this fight. I'm also fairly sure it changes whether there's one or multiple of them present, but I'll go over what I was able to figure out, which I think are also the most important parts. Any given Rocking Rebel will always get an extra action on its turn unless it is in a charging state, in which case its next turn will be just 1 action, but only 1 Rocking Rebel can be in the charging state at any given point in time. It will, on its extra action, sometimes enter this charging state, and allowing it to reach its next turn will cause it to use an AoE attack for heavy damage. The charging state can be dispelled via Weakness Break or Aha Instant, the former of which will simply stop the charging state, while the latter additionally it causes the Rocking Rebel to take 40% more damage for 2 turns and grants the team 10 punchline. Rocking Rebels also gains the Frenzied Rendition state when an Aha Instant occurs. If not under Frenzied Rendition, a given Rocking Rebel will sometimes use an enhancement that increases the speed of other enemies by 50% for 1 turn. Otherwise, it will instead deal HP damage and 20 toughness damage to other enemies, and has a chance to inflict Revelry to them for 1 turn, which prevents them from taking action. It will also grant the team 10 punchline. Frenzied Rendition is removed after this ability, and the toughness damage can break enemies, which will be considered imaginary break. This can cause imprisonment. Aside from that, Rocking Rebels have 2 sweep attacks in opposite directions as its standard attacks. The multi-target nature of them and its AoE attack are only relevant for some remembrance units. 1 livestream assistant will be summoned for Live Showdown during Phase 2 of the boss encounter. It has 2 attacks, the first of which is AoE, and the second of which is a standard single target attack. It will alternate between these 2 abilities. Now finally the main boss body, Super Idol Center of Attention. It always gets an extra action outside of Live Showdown, and will action advance if its HP is reduced enough without having initiated Live Showdown. During Live Showdown in Phase 1, Super Idol will no longer attack, but will instead buff subfield enemy crit rate by 25% for 1 turn, and advance their actions. If Live Showdown ends with the subfield character being defeated, the fight simply continues with the remaining characters. If the subfield character survived but was not able to defeat all subfield enemies, the boss deals a large amount of damage to the subfield character and inflicts them with Entanglement. This Entanglement ignores effect res, but can be blocked by effects that explicitly prevent CC, such as Fushan's skill and Everknight's ultimate state. Upon starting Phase 2, Super Idol will fully advance. For its first turn in Phase 2, or when the output ports have indicated preparing to go live, it will now use an AoE attack, followed by initiating Live Showdown. When out of Live Showdown and not initiating it, it will use the AoE attack, followed by a single target attack on its extra action. During Phase 2 Live Showdown, Super Idol's behavior is the same as in Phase 1, buffing subfield enemy crit rate and advancing their actions, but ending Live Showdown without defeating all of the subfield enemies now causes Super Idol to deal a large amount of AoE damage, which can randomly inflict a variety of negative effects. These debuffs include an attack reduction, defense reduction, speed reduction, damage dealt reduction, and entanglement. The damage and chance to apply these debuffs depend on the durability gauge representing the subfield enemies. Here's a summary of the boss encounter. Super Idol can initiate something called Live Showdown, which splits the fight into two battlefields. An ally unit of your designation goes to fight in the subfield against some enemy summons, while Super Idol itself and the output ports gain a large damage reduction buff, and they and the rest of your units remain in the prime field. Super Idol cannot be weakness broken during this period. Prime field allies can support the subfield unit by hitting output ports, which increase the subfield unit's res pen and decrease subfield enemy damage, but they otherwise cannot attack subfield enemies except through elation skills. Hitting output ports enough times deals % max HP damage to subfield enemies and grants punchline, but their stat counts reset at the start of Super Idol's turns regardless. Super Idol itself will opt to increase enemy crit rate and advance their actions instead of attacking during this period. If the subfield character is defeated or Live Showdown times out, you get nuked, depending on the phase, and the boss retains a portion of the damage reduction buff. Winning Live Showdown by defeating all of the summons, which differ between phases, deals damage, toughness damage, inflicts vulnerability, and recovers SP. Here are some general gameplay tips, starting with the most obvious one. Put your main DPS unit in the subfield, since Super Idol and the output ports gain 60% damage reduction during Live Showdown, and you need to clear the subfield to get your big damage window. Take some time to think about how you want to hit the output ports. You wouldn't want to be hitting a given output port that's already at the stack limit when those hits could be directed to the other output port that may not have reached the stack limit. In a similar vein, if you aren't able to hit one enough times, it may be worth it to hold onto ultimates until after Super Idol resets the output ports so you can max them out the next time. Lastly, try to distribute your damage evenly across the subfield enemies. That way you can get the most out of the damage dealt when reaching output port stack limits. The 15% max HP damage is per enemy, so you'd be losing value if any subfield enemy dies early. Now onto the character section. As a disclaimer, I lack a good portion of the characters on my account, so there's a lot that I am unable to personally test and or verify, but I'll go over some that I have used myself and others that I think may be noteworthy, in both good ways and bad ways, based on my observations and understanding of the mechanics. Also, as mentioned before, character selections are often heavily influenced by the current rotation's effects, independent of the actual boss and its mechanics. Disregarding that though, as a general rule of thumb, teams where the supports have frequent and or multi-target attacks typically perform better, since reaching the stack limit on output ports can significantly increase clear speed. Elation characters. Elation units makes clearing subfield enemies much more manageable, since aggressive reading materials get 50% damage reduction until receiving elation damage, and Rocking Rebels also have mechanics that directly interact with AHA instants to benefit the player. Aside from that, reaching stack limits for the output ports provides punchline, and winning Live Showdown immediately triggers an AHA instant, so anyone with an elation skill benefits. Elation skills themselves also allow supports in the prime field to attack subfield enemies. Spiral stats for the second half of 4.2 aren't out yet as of recording, but I was able to reach just under 3600 points with a team of Evanesha, EMC, Cypher, and Luocha. Break archetype. Once again, I wouldn't seriously consider using break characters without the Dahlia. Subfield enemies do have less toughness than their MOC variants, but the overall damage requirement is also much higher. Aside from the significant damage increase Dahlia provides, she's also good at hitting output ports, with a blast skill, AoE ultimate, and bounce follow-up attack. Firefly herself has built-in sustain, so you can easily run sustainless with her since the rest of the team would rarely be attacked. Archer. He can still clear with 3300, but he really wants RMC, Yaoguang, or Tribi as his last teammate because they can easily hit both output ports without spending SP. He still benefits from the SP recovery of course, but actually winning Live Showdown to get that SP is another question. Damage over time. Even though the way Heislin's, Black Swan, and Kafka's kits work together get around the split battlefield mechanic, dot unfortunately does not seem to work here as opposed to the MOC 4.0 variation of the boss. Subfield enemies are simply too spongy, and the team as a whole isn't great at hitting output ports. If you're watching this in AS 4.2, just use dot on the other side, since it actually has a dot buff. In general, aside from having characters with frequent multi-target attacks, units that focus more on buffing allies instead of debuffing enemies would typically be preferred, since the debuffers wouldn't be able to hit subfield enemies in the first place. This is more relevant now than before since Welt's Nova Flare has made him generally viable again. Cypher somewhat gets around the split battlefield because she just straight up applies a 40% damage vulnerability debuff by existing, but the effects from the light cones you'd run on her can't be utilized on subfield enemies. Zone effects from Luocha's talent, Jiaoche's ultimate, and the like fortunately do extend to both fields, but you'd only use Jiaoche with Acheron, and it's not enough to push her into relevance. I think I should note in case she gets a Nova Flare, though, that Acheron's Crimson Knot stack application follows whichever field she is in, even if the debuffs are applied to enemies on the other field, but this is not retroactive to already existing stacks. And that'll be it for my in-depth guide on the Super Idol Center of Attention boss. If you've got any questions, feedback, or suggestions, consider leaving them down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, found it helpful, and or enjoy watching my other content, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.